This video will review ways of thinking about cognitive complexity and scaffolding. Scaffolding at the curriculum level can involve either a progressive decrease in support from the instructor that mirrors a simultaneous increase in learner independence, or an increase in the level of complexity and ambiguity in the task that students are expected to complete. We're really going to focus on the latter because describing varying levels of independence is relatively straightforward, whereas varying the level of complexity and ambiguity can be more complicated. In terms of complexity, I want to focus on cognitive demands of a task. A task can be demanding because it requires a complex cognitive skill, or it can be demanding because it has a high level of ambiguity and complexity. And those two variables can interact. You can ask a student to use a fairly challenging cognitive skill, but you can reduce the number of variables that the students need to consider, reducing the complexity, or you can provide a framework or model that helps to guide students through analysis, reducing the ambiguity. Alternatively, you can ask students to use a relatively simple cognitive skill, but increase the demand of the task by presenting the problem without guidance or increasing the number of variables that students need to consider. How can educators scaffold curriculum? When it comes to evaluating and categorizing the difficulty of different cognitive skills, Bloom's taxonomy is always at the tip of my tongue. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework for categorizing educational goals. The model is hierarchical. The categories above understanding are presented as skills and abilities, with the assumption that a foundational knowledge is necessary for putting those higher level cognitive skills and abilities into practice. Just as a quick review, remembering refers to basic recall. Understanding involves demonstrating knowledge by organizing information or recognizing the main ideas. Applying is the use of acquired knowledge in new situations. Analyzing involves breaking things down to figure out relationships between different elements. Evaluating involves making arguments, defending positions, making judgments based on evidence, or making comparisons to some external criteria. And creating is taking seemingly independent ideas and building them up into something new. Bloom's taxonomy definitely still has its place, and I still use Bloom's all the time. But to understand some of the limitations of Bloom's taxonomy, I want to compare chess and checkers. Both require players to remember a set of rules. Both require players to apply their previous experience of their opponent's play to inform their strategies. Both require players to analyze their current position and evaluate possible moves in light of what their opponent might do next. According to Bloom's taxonomy, these two games are equivalent in terms of their cognitive complexity. But that's obviously not a valid assessment. Some educators assume that Bloom's taxonomy is prescriptive, that lower order skills need to be mastered before students can master higher order skills. This interpretation actually gives instructors a reason not to expect higher order cognitive skills from their students. My students struggle with comprehension and recall. How can I expect them to tackle application and evaluation? But the framework is actually descriptive rather than prescriptive. That means that students don't need to apply before they can analyze. It just means that analysis is more complex than application. It's similar to saying that a cartwheel is easier than a backflip, but there's no rule that you have to be able to do a cartwheel before you learn how to do a backflip. Another way to think about cognitive complexity is to consider it in terms of cognitive demand. Checkers and chess use the same higher order cognitive skills, but because the complexity and ambiguity of the rules and strategies, chess requires a more demanding level of those cognitive skills. It is possible to create low demand, higher order tasks in order to help students develop both their knowledge base and their ability to use these complex cognitive skills. In this example, students are asked to solve a simple conflict. A more cognitively demanding version of this task might involve asking students to consider more variables or giving them more choice about how to proceed. But rather than presuming that cognitive skill level is the only variable that's involved in cognitive complexity, teachers can tweak almost any level of question by reducing its demand but not its cognitive skill level, and simultaneously increasing the support offered to students. Finally, educators can feel a false sense of security around cognitive levels in Bloom's because of its association with specific verbs. But verbs are no guarantee. I have a research methods course, and I assign students a series of critical thinking writing entries that ask them to critique research methods in a psychology experiment described through a popular science article. Here are 2 examples of students' responses. These 2 students interpreted the verb evaluate to mean different things. The student on the left interpreted evaluate to mean describe how much you like this, while the other student interpreted evaluate to mean explain whether the methods were appropriate for the context. Most instructors have at least a passing familiarity with Bloom's taxonomy, but I'd like to explore another model of teaching and learning that considers cognitive complexity, Big Solo model. SOLO stands for the structure of observed learning outcomes and describes stages of increasing complexity in students' understanding of a subject. One thing I really love about Big Solo model is that the visual representation is a graph, and I love data. Along the y-axis is competence, increasing as you move up the axis. Along the x-axis are the different stages, each one corresponding to an increase in a student's competence on the subject. In the pre-structural stage, students have missed the point completely. This stage is associated with 0 competence on a topic or skill. Hopefully, students move on from there into the unistructural stage. And in the unistructural stage, students are capable of representing one relevant aspect. At the multistructural stage, students can now represent several relevant aspects, but they're represented independently of one another. In the relational stage, students have now integrated their acquired knowledge of skills into a structure, so they can now represent the relationships between different elements in the structure. In the extended abstract stage, students are now capable of generalizing their knowledge and skills to a new domain. Big's model for me is more intuitive than Bloom's taxonomy, and that's the feedback that I get a lot from faculty when I present this model in a workshop. And if you are partial to the verb list in Bloom's taxonomy, no worries. Big's also has verbs associated with each one of the stages. Let's look back at the low demand and high demand examples we were looking at in the context of Bloom's taxonomy. From the perspective of Big Solo model, it's actually relatively easy to see that these 2 tasks, while both involving analysis, are associated with different stages of learning. The low demand task is likely multistructural, while the increased complexity and ambiguity of the high demand version means that it's more closely aligned with relational and potentially the extended abstract stage, depending on the specific assignment details. My experience is that scaffolding is easier for faculty to conceptualize using both models. It's the end of this module. You should be able to explain how cognitive complexity can help educators scaffold the curriculum. Summarize the pros and cons of Bloom's taxonomy. Compare and contrast Bloom's taxonomy and Big Solo model. And use learning taxonomies and the concept of cognitive complexity to write scaffolded learning outcomes.